5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
A shooting star in a film noir. I'm floating around 10 feet on the ground. I'm floating around 10 feet on the ground. I am no average Joe. Be with me and you will see more than you ever wanted to.
Hey folks, how are you? Nice to see everybody here. ASPA 60, Charlotte J, Carolina Puerto, Craig Roach. How are you guys doing? Nice to see you regulars back here. This is the kind of an anniversary show, 25th show. I've made it this far. And it's because of you guys. Thank you so much for being here. As always, we're going to go with all caps for questions, lower caps to chat amongst yourself. What else? One more live show, and then the show after that will be pre-recorded because I'll be elsewhere. Doing some important Bigfoot stuff, I'm happy to say. Let's see, what else? Thanks to Doug and Alex Highcheck for all their support. Thanks to you guys for all your support. And I guess today we're going to be talking about reporting and how to basically increase the accuracy and scientific validity of your reports that you take on expeditions. So the story today, look a show over 24. Thanks, John. I appreciate that. Today we're going to be talking about conducting debriefing interviews. By debriefing, I mean when you come back from an evening expedition or a daytime expedition for that matter. Things to consider as if you're one of the people interviewing the people that have had the Bigfoot experience. Referring primarily to type A or Class A or Class B sightings, because those are the ones with increased potential for trauma. And following these procedures will not only increase the accuracy of the reports that you take, but I'll be talking about how to preserve them and how this whole process can help prevent PTSD from developing overnight. Hey, Eric, how are you, sir? Nice to see you, buddy. I appreciate you being here. So, as usual, I'm going to start with a story. I'm feeling that pressure to bust through this, and now I got to realize I've got 2 hours to bust through this, so I've got to kind of relax and slow my pace here. As always, I'm going to start with a little bit of a story. And this is one situation where I wish I could have everybody raise their hands, because although I know some of my regulars quite well, some of them I don't know quite well. And I really don't have much of an appreciation for how many of you folks out there have actually been out on an organized expedition. And when I wrote this book, began writing this book my second year into my expeditions. And most of my expeditions have been done with BFRO organization, Lori Wade and Charlie. Geez, I can't believe I'm blocking on Charlie's last name. Charlie Raymond. And of course, I also go out with Southeastern Sasquatch Investigating Organization. And these, although in the book they were written primarily for large group investigations, these will work with relatively small group investigations as well. So, given that I'm not sure of the baseline of expedition experience, mostly my story today is going to be a personal information about my experiences in the typical format that you experience on a BFRO expedition. And so usually a BFRO expedition runs a Thursday to a Sunday, at least the ones that I've been on. Getting up there Thursday by noon, typically that's a 3 to 4 hour drive. So I'm getting up, hooking up my trailer, hitting the road pretty early, and I got about a 3 or 4 hour drive. Let me see something here, Eric. I'm still trying to clearly connect the search for Bigfoot sightings, regardless of class, and how significantly this connects to PTSD. Awesome question. So, a Class A sighting, Eric, is when you got a clear, visible sighting of Bigfoot. And in a clear, visible sighting of Bigfoot, there is no doubt that it's Bigfoot. It looks big, like Bigfoot. You can see it clear enough and close enough to be pretty sure or completely sure that it's not a guy in a Bigfoot outfit or an ape or a gorilla outfit. These can occur anywhere from 300 yards out from where you're standing to, I think, I've heard literally some face-to-face sightings within a foot of each other. And yes, there are occasions and reports where people have been abducted, been threatened, maybe even caused some physical injury with Bigfoot. But when you're that close to this kind of apex predator, it's not unusual for somebody to, one, have their fight-flight mode kick in. And oftentimes, especially on night ops, these can be kind of traumatizing sightings for more than a few people. And so with trauma, as you know, frequently can come PTSD. A Class B sighting is when you don't necessarily see the Bigfoot clear. You might see an outline of Bigfoot in the night. It looks unequivocally Bigfoot, but given the darkness, it's difficult to see. Your view might be obstructed by trees or some other obstacles. Also, under Class B sightings, you're going to have experiences like tree knocks, roars, whoops, screams, finding footprints, casting footprints. And these, for the average researcher, I would think would be a little less potentially traumatizing. but I've shared 2 of my own personal Class B sightings, and they were, they created a visceral experience. Let's just say it that way. The fight flight kicked in. I wasn't traumatized per se, but some fear kicks in, some anxiety, if you will. And, depending on the person, their experience, and the dramaticness, if you will, of the sighting, that can also create trauma. A Class C sighting is kind of hearing a secondhand story from somebody else. Okay. So, most people who go on, I think not just speaking for myself, but most people go on an expedition of having a Class A sighting, seeing Bigfoot, knowing for oneself that Bigfoot is real because you've seen him close enough and distinct enough to have no doubt that this was a Bigfoot that you saw. So usually when I head off in the morning, of course, I've got Bigfoot on the brain. I'm a little wound up. I'm a little excited. I'm thinking about Bigfoot, hoping to have a Bigfoot experience. Typically arrive around midday on Thursday. Say hello to folks, meet some new folks. And the main goal then is to get your camp set up and everything prepped. If you're using equipment, you're going to put your batteries on your recorder or your FLIR or your camera on charge to make sure it's fully charged for the night out. And just generally kind of prepare yourself, prepare your camp, and chat with folks until about 4 o'clock. That's typically when Lori has her first group meeting. And in the group meeting, she will kind of sit in a circle around, typically at that point, a non-burning campfire, unless it's a late fall, winter kind of expedition, in which case the campfire will be going to keep you warm. And she would lay out some of the ground rules, some of the courtesies. One of the things I repeatedly did in my first couple sightings, or not first couple sightings, first couple expeditions, we're wearing headlamps, typically red headlamps. And when you stop and talk to somebody and you look them in the face, you're generally going to be shining your lamp right in their face. And that makes things kind of rough to look at each other. And so you want to either turn off your lamp in those situations or divert the light that's directly in the person's face up or down up towards the sky or down through the ground towards the ground. Staying on the trail, staying with a group. When you go out on night ops, no one ever wanders off alone. You always kind of buddy up. And if somebody has to leave the little subgroup, they don't go back to camp or they don't walk by themselves. Somebody goes back with them for safety's sake. And then we introduce ourselves around the circle. Typically people talk a little bit about who they are and the expeditions and any experiences that they've had on in terms of expeditions. And one of the unique things I think about the BFRO expeditions I've been on, they tend to be rather large. You could be talking a minimum of 20, 25 people, up to 50 people in an expedition. That's a lot of folks. A lot of folks. There's typically what Lori calls newbies. Newbies meaning it's a person that is on an expedition for their first time. And after the introductions, there's also then typically a newbie meeting where some more details are shared and discussed to make sure the newer folks get the importance of certain points and the do's and don'ts. One of the nice things about Lori's expeditions, BFRO expeditions, as well as Charlie Raymond's BFRO expeditions and his KBRO, Kentucky Bigfoot Research Organization expeditions, is meals are provided. Lori's expeditions, breakfast and dinner, and everybody's asked to bring something to donate to a snack table. And so all those snacks are put out onto the table for you to munch on as you see fit. And mostly that's how people deal with their lunch, using the snack table. And this is kind of unusual with Lori and Charlie, as the typical BFRO expeditions, the leaders don't go all out like these two folks do to provide meals. Typically on a BFRO expedition, you're required to take care of your own food. I think both Lori and Charlie find that it's easier when you provide a meal to have a captive audience to move on to the introduction for night ops after a break. People are already there. People are already focused after a meal. And so after dinner, Lori and her team, or Charlie and his team, will have gone out either a week before or a month before the expedition and scouted out the area. They use a big map of the forest or the park that we're going to be squatching in, and they check it out ahead of time. One expedition in Tennessee, there were lots of creeks or cricks, as some people call them. And so on the one location, we had to get across 3, maybe 4 creeks that you couldn't hop across. And so, for example, for people's safety, ahead of time, Lori had strung ropes from tree to tree across these creeks and used some pallets, some wooden pallets, to construct some bridges so you could walk across the creek without having to get your shoes wet, especially in late fall, winter expeditions. Getting your feet wet out at night can eventually get pretty uncomfortable. So, these folks really go the extra mile to make sure everybody's safe, make sure everybody's dry. Everything's in place ahead of time. And also in that week, they're typically scouting for tracks, looking for Bigfoot signs so that they can find a more or less hotspots within the area. You can imagine if there's a group of 50 people, sending people out into the woods, if it's not organized well, can lead to quite the calamity. And so one of the things I admire about what both these folks do is that group of 50 is typically divided up into groups of 4 to 6. I'd say average is 5. And so you go out in mini groups, and each leader of the mini group is typically risen to the status of an investigator. In BFRO, you've got 3 statuses: newbie, researcher, and investigator. And an investigator is kind of the top of the heap, somebody who has been on a lot of expeditions, have some experience with Bigfoot. They're going to take the lead in the smaller groups in guiding people to these areas. And so all that is coordinated after dinner. And after that's coordinated, you're assigned to a particular group with a particular investigator. And that investigator will then gather his or her subgroup up and make some plans about when they're going to head out in their cars to get to their spot, and make sure everybody knows what to bring. Typically you're going to bring, I carry a night sack, and most people do. Typically you're going to bring a chair. I've got a little mini chair that I can sit down in that goes into my pack. You're going to want to bring some water, because it seems, interestingly enough, when it's raining, you're walking around in a Gore-Tex shell or a rubber shell. And I find I sweat more on days when it's rainy and chilly than on moderate kind of days. So bringing a change of clothes, or being able to strip some of your layers off or add some layers. For the fight flight experiences, interestingly enough, Lori does include a change of underwear in her night pack list, because it happens sometimes that when people's fight flight response kick in, they may poop or pee themselves, and you don't want to walk around the rest of the evening carrying that load, be it liquid or solid. Binoculars, night vision cameras. I'm kind of anti-tech. I don't like those things, but people bring their own. I carry one piece of equipment besides extra batteries and a chair, and that is a barred owl call. It's believed that Sasquatch will imitate barred owls to communicate with each other. And so I carry a barred owl call with me, and I am not very skillful with it. But I've been shocked about how often I've let out a barred owl call and start getting conversations going with other barred owls, or goodness only knows if it's a Bigfoot or not. I keep hearing that when you spend enough time out in the woods, you can kind of tell if you hear barred owl call, if it's kind of off. And if it's kind of off or unusual in some way, that increases the likelihood that it could be Bigfoot. So you pack your night pack, you meet at a designated time. Typically, you start heading out at about 9 o'clock. So you're heading out in the dark. And you go to the closest area to your spot where you can park a vehicle safely and without getting stuck. And then there's anywhere from a couple feet walk if you're going to be squatching at a site close to the road, up to a 3-mile hike to get to the location where you're going to do your primary investigations for the evening. And Lori and I don't know why I'm blocking. Lori and Charlie, they take pretty much all comers. And so you've got people of various fitness levels. They take people with disabilities who can't walk hardly at all. And they take people on the other end of the continuum that could hike 10 miles in a day if they needed to. And so that kind of goes into considering what group you're going to be a part in. And the investigators will know the distance or have a good estimate of the distance you're going to need to hike to go to your main squatching location. They also have backup spots as well if that doesn't bear out or if that doesn't work out. Depending on the philosophy of the investigator, you might hike to your location stealthy and quiet. Some believe just acting natural, so in a normal voice, conversing with each other, not trying to be stealthy at all. And there are some people, some investigators, that find that the louder you are, the more raucous you are, the more likely you are to catch the attention of the Bigfoot. So you kind of follow that lead. You kind of follow the lead of the primary investigator during that walk to the specific location in which you're going to be doing your investigation. Sometimes people will bring a fire log, and once you get to your destination, you'll start a fire. Other times, the leader will choose not to start a fire, and you kind of stay in this one general vicinity. Most of the investigators, and of course the fires happen, the colder it is, the more likely it is you're going to have a little fire at your investigation area. But I think most investigators, after the hike there, generally start with 15 to 20 to 30 minutes of quiet, just to see if your presence has captured the attention or drawn the attention of any Bigfoots that are coming to investigate you. Basically, and this was a fascinating concept to me when I started doing this, you're making yourself the Bigfoot bait. We try to give them the high ground, so a real squatchy area, so to speak, an area that looks like it has high Bigfoot potential for activity, might include a ridge line with a stream running at the base, and you're sitting at the bottom of that ridge line, giving the Sasquatch the high ground and their ability to look at you and monitor you and then decide whether they're going to interact or not with you and in what way they're going to interact. So you'll hang out at that spot, depending on whether you get any activity, hour and a half, 2, 3, 4 hours. If you're getting lots of activity, you may never move on to the secondary or backup spot for the night. If you're not getting a lot of activity, again, the investigators typically do have at least one, sometimes two backup spots to check out. But when you're dealing with so many people in an investigation, one of the important things to do is make sure you don't step on each other when you're out at night. And by step on each other, I mean that, with 50 people, that those 10 groups that are out there, smaller groups of 5, for example, they're not real close to each other. And in the groups, one person is designated as the recorder. And we carry walkie-talkies with each other. One person, if not more, has a walkie-talkie in each group, so you can communicate with other groups. The recorder's job, it's literally a little notepad that you can fit into your pocket and a pencil. And if after half hour, 20 minutes to a half hour, you don't get any activity, depending on the group leader's preference, you may begin to do some provocations. And exactly what provocation you do and how frequently you do it again, is kind of guided by the investigator in the group. And those provocations can range from a loud imitating yell of a Bigfoot to a whoop to a tree knock to stone clacks, any kind of auditory provocation in the hopes of getting the Bigfoot's attention. But at the time that you decide to do a provocation, you will first go on the radio and contact the other groups and let them know that you're going to do a whoop in 2 minutes. And the importance of this, again, comes back to not wanting to step on each other. If you're going to do a provocation, you want the other groups to know you're going to do a provocation and exactly when you're going to do a provocation, because you don't want that to be misinterpreted as a Bigfoot making that sound. You want everybody in the expedition to understand that that's a human making that sound rather than a Bigfoot, because you don't want to mistake them. And so the recording individual will write down the exact time that the provocation is made and exactly what the provocation was or is. And then if there's any response, it's their job to also record the response that comes as a result of the provocation. And so I think that's excellent in making those kind of recordings and ensuring that everybody knows what everybody else is doing. And if we're getting a response, we're not mistaking a provocation by another group as a response. And I think that's good science for what it's worth. As most of you guys know, I'm here promoting bringing more science into investigations. And that's that documentation is very important. So depending on the activity, you may stay in that location, you may move on. Typically when you move on, you're hiking back to your vehicle. You're more focused on getting from point A to point B. You're more goal directed. And then you either move on to your next spot, or if you've been out and getting lots of activity in that one spot, you may be heading directly back to camp. Typically, when you head back to camp, you may be the first group back, but you may not be. And so all the other groups, or a single group or nobody, will be waiting there for you to return to camp. And typically, if you're in, people start talking about what they experienced in camp. And everybody kind of hangs out around the fire until all the groups are in for that evening. And then, spontaneous conversations erupt and people start talking about their experience. Eventually, you go to bed. The next morning, you wake up. Again, on Lori and I think in Charlie's expeditions, they serve breakfast. So you have breakfast, and then after breakfast, you have what's known as a debriefing. And by debriefing, what I mean is all the groups get together, and one by one, the groups stand up and they report their experiences. We did this in such and such a time, and we got a tree knocked back, or we heard a whoop within 3 minutes after our tree knock. And that generates discussion around, if other people heard it, what other people heard. And you're basically comparing notes with other groups. And again, I think that's awesome, and that's a good thing. And that goes on in that pattern, Thursday into Friday, Friday into Saturday, Saturday into Sunday. Sunday, not a big breakfast, kind of just snacking, do the final group debriefing, and pack up and head on your way. Very fun. You meet lots of good people. I've never personally had a Class A, but I've had many Class Bs, two of which, as I said earlier, were quite unnerving. You know, you're never guaranteed a Class A or even a Class B encounter, but I can't recall an expedition that I've been on. I've been on around 20 between Charlie and Lori. I can't recall an expedition where we didn't at least have some Class B evidence come in. On occasion, Class A evidence. People experience Class A sightings. The last expedition I went out earlier in the year with Lori, the group that she was in, most everybody experienced a Class A sighting. So there's no guarantee, but generally you're going to have some kind of Bigfoot experience, at least based on my experience. So that all sounds well and good, and it is good. But what I want to talk about today is I want to talk about how to hold on to that information of the debriefings or of the interviews so that you can maintain the integrity of the verbal evidence or written evidence that's there. And basically, in this episode, I'm going to be kind of outlining some suggested procedures to maintain the integrity of that evidence, to conduct interviews in a specific way, and in doing so, also minimize the chance of developing PTSD. Any questions from anyone before we move on to the slide presentation? One of the nice things I'm hoping with my extended interview or extended format here now, we've got up to 2 hours rather than the 1 hour, is give people more time to ask questions. There are no dumb questions. I'm not going to scoff at your question. I may not even be able to answer your question. My expertise lies in applying psychological science to this process. I am not an expert in Bigfoot. No doubt in my audience, there are people who have more expertise in Bigfoot. But like many researchers, I'm of the opinion that there is no such thing as an expert in the field. Honestly, when I think of experts in the field, people's names like Jeff Meldrum come up, Amy Boo comes up, Matt Moneymaker comes up, Bobo Fay, Cliff Brackman. I mean, these are names that most of you folks are going to recognize if you've been interested in Bigfoot for a while. And John A makes a good point. The only dumb questions are the ones that are unasked, and that I do truly believe that. You can't learn if you don't ask questions. So let's see here. Where are we going to go from here? And that's not it. That's not it. There we go. So just a little graphic. We're talking interviews, debriefings. And again, let me emphasize, just in case of what I'm told, that not everybody would appreciate what the word debriefing might even mean. And debriefing is just asking questions and taking in information from individuals that had a Bigfoot experience, formally documenting that information for the future and for any research that might come from that. And so the title of my presentation tonight is a Sasquatch Reporting Accuracy Tutorial. Procedures to ensure and preserve accuracy while minimizing potential PTSD. So I guess the first obvious question is, why the heck are you going to even bother to think about that? Why do you want to be concerned about the reports? People are just reporting their experience. Well, I think one of the good things and good policies, if you will, that BFRO has is that when you have a Bigfoot experience or a potential Bigfoot experience, your first thing you do after that experience is complete is you don't move to your next spot. You stay in that location and you try and debunk the experience that you just had. What just happened? Could that have been a landslide rather than a bluff charge? Could that have been coyotes howling rather than a Bigfoot howling? And so, of course, when you're doing that debunking, you're conversing within your subgroup. And in doing that conversing, on one hand, the best time to talk about that is right after it happens. But on the other hand, that's also potentially one of the worst times to do it, because if it was kind of a butt-puckering experience, people's arousal levels are going to be up. They may be experiencing trauma, and both increased arousal past normal and trauma can distort people's perception of what they just experienced. On one of my most exciting Class B encounters, we had a tree fall. It sounded like right on top of us, but the tree never made it down to the fire road we were on. And then you heard what sounded like other stones and logs rolling down a steep hill and hitting either other stones or logs and becoming airborne. So suddenly there would be silence, and then you'd hear it crashing in the leaves and rolling some more, getting airborne, crashing and rolling. And we were convinced that what was happening was a landslide. I don't think any of us initially thought about a Bigfoot. Well, when the tree fell, it was like an explosion going off. And, that, I think most people's minds went to Bigfoot immediately. But it had been raining hard the night before. And so it was possible that the tree could have just fell in the woods because of the drainage. Could have just been at the right time for that tree to fall. The force with which it fell and the explosive nature with which it fell kind of suggested the possibility of a Bigfoot, but you couldn't really rule out Mother Nature coming into play there. So we stood, we talked about what we experienced, and we stayed there for 45 minutes trying to figure out what happened. The only thing that happened to us that at that time was a dust cloud of loam. If you've ever smelled loam, it's very rich, kind of a pungent soil. A dust cloud of loam came down on top of us. and loam has a distinct kind of decaying smell about it. But we were all shocked, of course. I mean, we were expecting rocks and trees to be coming down at us, literally rolling down off the mountain onto the road in front of us. But that never happened. So, if that was scary enough for anyone in the group, that could have set up a trauma cycle. Or for sure, I don't think anyone in our group was traumatized by that by the time it was all said and done, but we all reacted with increased arousal and increased stress. And in the instant that you're reacting that way, you're primed for hypnosis. You're primed for something called confabulation. You're primed for developing memory gaps. And what confabulation is if you have a memory gap to a traumatic or unnerving event, and there's a blank spot in your memory, our brains themselves, without us having to think to do it, we like to maintain a state of equilibrium, an evenness about us. And when you can't figure out what happens, that's called dissonance. There's an inconsistency between your experience and what you understand happening. And your brain will can take the wheel on its own and fill in those blank spots to reduce that dissonance, whether what your brain fills in is an accurate memory or not. Also, over time, the accuracy of a memory will fade. Memories can distort with time. Confabulation and memory distort the impact then of the data accuracy and any research that you do based on that data. I kind of call this the fisherman phenomena. I don't know how many people fish out there, but if you do fish and you've been fishing for a while, you know by the end of the night fishing, a fish that was this big, as time passes, can grow bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's not, well, fishermen are good liars, but that's not necessarily even lying in that situation. Sometimes that can just be, a typical response. Because even in fishing, if you got a big fish on, your arousal gets up, it can accelerate your heart rate, the adrenaline starts flowing, and, it's not uncommon for people to overestimate the size of their fish. And then again, with trauma or increased arousal, that kind of sets the stage for PTSD to develop from a Class A or a Class B encounter. And the procedures we're about to talk about will help minimize the potential development of PTSD from these events. Any questions so far? So why bother is all those particular reasons. Again, what we're striving for in all research, be it experiential research or scientific research, we're striving for our data to be accurate and remain accurate. So here we get into some suggestions to ensure and preserve report accuracy. And this could kind of build on some other recent shows about photographs and films and do they have any scientific value. And this would be in the time frame of the evening of a expedition, this would be when people are arriving back in camp and you discover that either certain members in that group, subgroup, or all the members in that group experienced a Class A or a Class B encounter. No lie, in Land Between the Lakes, I was standing shoulder to shoulder with Larry Stillwell, and we had designated, I'm going to scan to the left looking for any sights or sounds of Bigfoot, and he was going to scan to the right. He saw a large dark figure cross the road, probably 20, 30 feet from us. Unmistakable. Its size, the speed at which it occurred, the gait that was evidenced in this walking across the road. And I never got to see the thing because I was looking to the left. So when you start taking a report of people's experiences, number one, you want to film and or record that report. And you want to do that in a private place away from the rest of the crowd. Right when people come back is when a person's memory is potentially the most accurate, but at the same time, it's also the most vulnerable to confabulation. Again, your brain making things up for you without you having to think about it, or from talking about it, the experience, right after it happened. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. It could be, your memories could be potentially the most accurate, but they could also potentially be the most skewed or inaccurate. And so I recommend that those interviews, those stories, are done with one or two members of the group who have been specifically trained in dealing with interviewing people about their experience. And getting back to film or camera, this is a time where for sure you want to have a good video camera. But if you really want to juice things up, you could have a regular camera requiring lighting, but you also might have like a FLIR or a thermal camera. Because sometimes as people tell these stories, they begin to relive them. And honestly, I don't know, but with temperature sensitive cameras, you might be able to record the changes in the person's body temperature. When we're under stress, our blood flows away from our hands and our feet and our head to the core of our body. And so that's going to be the warmest part on the human being's body. As we begin to relax and de-stress from that situation, our veins in our brain and in our hands and arms are going to begin to expand and allow more blood to flow back to those areas. And it's just an idea. You may be able to pick up with that on a thermal camera. You may not. I think it's a worthwhile thing to investigate. And that could be a little study in and of itself. So, what other suggestions besides filming? On the way back to base camp, and this is a tough one, you want to minimize further discussion on the way, whether it's when you're walking back to the car or you're driving or you're arriving at base camp. And I'm not talking don't talk at all, sit in silence, but further discussion about the event. And why is this? I'm sure at some point in most of our lives, maybe in grade school or junior high school, you played the old whisper down the alley game, where somebody whispers something into the very first person in line, and then they've got to pass it on to the next person behind them, and then that person passes it on to the next person behind them, and it goes so on and so forth from one person in the front all the way to the person in the back. And if you recall doing this exercise, what happens? More often than not, the message that was heard by the first person and the message that was heard by the last person are quite dissimilar as they got passed from one person to the next. And so just the process of getting in conversation about the event, just something simple as that, can begin to distort the information and the accuracy of the report. I already talked about when you're returning, walking back to your car after an event. Again, at that point, we're focused and we're goal directed. And if those of you who are around when I did my show in hypnosis, the first step in hypnosis is to narrow your focus of attention. Then relaxation. And during those times, you're going to be more vulnerable to suggestion, hypnotic influences. You don't have to go into a deep trance with a watch waving in front of your face to have a hypnotic suggestion be given or taken by your unconscious mind. And so when we're walking back to the car after an event, in fact, we're taking one of the first steps, narrowing your focus of attention. And depending on how long you've been out, you may be physically tired at that point, and your body's starting to unwind and relax from the intensity of the encounter. So you're more open to the possibility of suggestion then. Any questions? So there are a couple other reasons why you want to minimize discussion. I've used the fancy scientific phrase of regression to the mean. But generally what happens is in a group of 4, you may have 4 different experiences of what people perceived in that event. And the more we talk about that amongst ourselves, the stories then begin to confirm and narrow down so that we begin to lose diverging details of the story as we're trying to make sense of that event that just happened. And that's called regression to the mean in statistics. Basically, it's a form of bias whereby we begin to lose details and begin to conform, to kind of a group process. Those diverging details in that kind of situation, the observations, the information, they lose their value and strength of importance through that kind of confirmation bias, hypnotic influences, social suggestion, conformity, or confabulation. And while that's going on, the accuracy of your data, you're losing it. It's getting downgraded because the stories are gradually going to become less diverse and more similar in nature. Craig Roach and I, at this last expedition with BFRO, we were just talking about this last week. We had Craig's car backed up in a little cul-de-sac or little turnaround area, and we heard a tree push. We were both sitting there with our windows rolled down. He was in the driver's seat. I was in the passenger seat, and a tree push down or fall down or whatever you want to call it happened. And did you hear that? Yeah, I heard that. What did you hear? Just between him and I, we had two different stories of what we just heard. Was it one tree crashing into another? Did a total of three trees fall? Was it more than three? Was it less than three? Even though we were sitting side by side when we experienced that. And as it turns out, when we went back to the debriefing the next day, another group heard that, but they thought they heard gunshots. So this makes me want to revisit this point of the difference between sensation and perception. When you reach down and pick up a hot log that you can't see is hot because there's no fire blazing on it, and you pick it up thinking it's cool, but it's still hot from the fire. That pain signal, electrochemical signal, when your hand touches that hot wood, travels up your arm, through your arm, into your spinal cord, up around your neck, and eventually registers on your brain. The millisecond that before that registers on your brain, that's called sensation. The millisecond that registers on your brain, that's called perception. Perception is not a pure experience of sensation because how we perceive things is determined by our life experience. You can, we we had a little bit of a sadistic scout leader when I was a kid growing up, and we would do this torture scenario where we would have somebody take their uh, shirt off and put their fire to their back to the fire, and let their back get hotter and hotter. They could feel the flames on their back. But behind them, we would have a cooler of ice and ice water. And as the person got more and more freaked about the possibility of, their back burning up, somebody would take a big couple glasses of that water and pour them on the back of that person's back, that ice water. And that person experienced that as if they were being branded or it was hot. They were being touched by the fire. So a purely cold sensation can be misinterpreted as a hot sensation. And that practice finally stopped when one person that was done to began to develop welts on their stomach or on their back as if they had been touched by a hot iron. Their body actually interpreted that as fire and had that histamine reaction, and the person's skin got red and bubbled up a little bit. So the point being, as we're talking, we're going from the pure sensation of what we experienced, and we begin talking about what we perceived. And everybody, no two people perceive the same thing in the same way. And so again, there's another potential for the accuracy of your data to get downgraded. Then when you get back to the camp, that downgraded information gets shared by the group, and that then further contaminates the accuracy of your experience. Is this making sense, guys? if the information doesn't get downgraded or fall by the wayside, oftentimes it'll get strengthened. The people are so sure that it actually happened this way that they begin to develop what I call a righteousness bias. I'm right. Craig might have heard it this way, but I'm so certain about how I heard it that it had to happen this way. We get cocky and increasingly uncertain or more certain about what it was that happened. And again, when you develop that righteousness bias, I'm right. Again, that's contaminating the accuracy of your final data set. Another thing that can happen, especially in larger groups, is the strength of a person's personality, just through the sheer force of their personality or through their popularity in their group. Their version of the story becomes the final version, whether that's most accurate or not. Thank you, ASPA60. I'm going to put that up if you don't mind. Certainly, Dr. John, very helpful. We can all be delusional at times, based and biased on our own reality tunnels. Yeah, we perceive things through our own glasses, and not everybody's wearing the same glasses to filter our realities through, even when we're talking consensus reality. Awesome point, ASPA60. Thank you. So here we go. Here we go with now more suggestions of procedures to employ in your debriefing to increase the accuracy. Keep in mind, we're already video and or audio taping the interview. If you're in a group with multiple people who go out together, you want to develop some standardized debriefing interviews so that if two people of the four in the group had an experience, one debriefer or interviewer takes one person to one location, another interviewer takes the other to the other location, and they simultaneously hear the story and interview the story. Okay. But if one of the interviewers is asking questions in a different way, in a different order, compared to the other person who's interviewing the other person, there's no standard criteria for the flow of the interview. And that can, in and of itself, can potentially distort the accuracy of your interview. So if you develop a standardized debriefing interview that each interview follows, that interview is going to become standardized and increasing reliable in that process, and your data, therefore, will become more reliable. And you want not only validity in your reports. Validity is when, are you interviewing about what you think you're interviewing? Are you interviewing about a Bigfoot experience? Reliability is, are you repeatedly interviewing about the same thing from one time to another to another? So by having a standardized interview in place that all the people doing the interview or debriefing use, you increase the reliability of the interview, and therefore you increase the reliability of the reporting that you get. You want to do the debriefing as soon as possible. Don't delay doing that interview when somebody walks into camp. Now, this can be a real practical challenge, honestly, and I appreciate that, because, people are coming into camp anywhere from 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock in the morning. And a lot of people are just ready for bed. But you want to do it before people go to bed that night, if at all possible. One, it increases the accuracy of the story as people recall it. Number two, it minimizes the distortion by further uncontrolled conversations, people just staying around waiting for the next group to come in, and they start talking about the conversations between each other. And other group members start asking questions that can contaminate that data, which is one of the reasons why science doesn't consider anecdotal data strong science. And more importantly, from my perspective as a psychologist, if you let people go to sleep and they've had a traumatic experience, they may have traumatic dreams, and those dreams may be an accurate recollection of the trauma that they experienced. Or if they develop memory blanks or blocks, again, that process of confabulation, the brain making up its own story and filling in that blank so that dissonance or discomfort is decreased. And that increases the likelihood then of PTSD setting in. If you study psychology and you study being a therapist, as I have, the old adage, once you get bucked off a horse, it's important to get right back on that horse as soon as you can. And that's kind of the foundation for anxiety counseling and anxiety therapy. The longer you delay facing that traumatic event, the deeper that anxiety and that trauma digs its claws into you, and the more difficult it becomes to deal with that anxiety, and the more resilient anxiety that you experience. One of my good friends, Legacy Nicely dog training, kind of came in late. And yeah, Jessica, what part of what you missed is you want to do video and audio recording of people's stories as they come in, because that creates a record of the data that you're collecting. And it's kind of an immutable record because it's recorded. And I didn't mention this, but if you get that recorded, later on when somebody talks about it, if you record that talk, then you can look and monitor and compare the two stories to see if that fish or that Bigfoot is getting bigger or smaller, or whether other details about the story are dropping out as the story is retold. Hope that makes sense to you. Again, I've already talked about videotaping or audio taping all tellings or interviews of the story, and I just kind of described what we're talking about. So, as I've said before, Jessica knows a whole lot about behavioralism. She's a world-class dog trainer and uses behavioral techniques in training dogs. And I always get confused about what the clever hands effect is, because we don't use that phrase in psychology. But you're setting up a standardized set of questions, and that is in an attempt to minimize distortion of the information you get simply as a result of variability in how the questions are asked or the order that they're asked, if that answers your question. So I think the answer is yes. Every time we talk about the clever hands effect, I can never remember what it was, and you're clarifying that it's unknown cues that lead the person to answer what we want. Yeah, your questions become kind of a demand effect, or the way you ask your questions demands or suggests a certain answer to the person answering the question. Eric, if you don't mind, I'm going to put your comment up. I'm not getting it. Immutable data from self-report. Isn't that anecdotal, and hence it's not empirically driven data? We had this discussion about my thoughts about the empirical method. Yes, this, earlier I said that anecdotal data is the weakest form of scientific data. The scientists don't like it. If we were able to prove Bigfoot's existence through anecdotes, we would have had it proven, 45, 50 years ago. But what these suggestions are, the suggestions I'm providing here, Eric, are to make that data less mutable or less likely to change, or if there is a change in the data, that can be tracked or monitored, and add some empiricism to the data itself, if that makes any sense to you. Thanks. In doing the interview, you're basically just using good counseling and therapy skills. The first pass at the story, you just allow them to tell their story the first time completely and uninterrupted. Let them get it off their chest. Don't keep interrupting them in the middle of it. You then ask them to tell their story again, but during the second telling, you can ask questions, but make sure those questions are non-leading and open-ended questions. Non-leading, like, well, the first time you told, an example of a leading question would be, the first time you told the story, you didn't mention anything about the face. Did you notice anything interesting about the face or the eyes, or the eyes red or green, or, those are leading questions, and they're not open-ended questions. Open-ended questions, the point of an open-ended question is to get the person to spontaneously elaborate with more details. Closed-ended questions reduce the number of details you get, and you get less information. So an example of an open-ended question after the person tells their story the first time would be, tell me more about that story, or tell me anything else you might remember about that story. You're not directing them to your own biases about Bigfoot. Well, what color was the hair, or what color were the eyes, or how long were the arms? Those are directing and leading questions, and they're not open-ended questions. Now we're moving on to the third, and Jessica, you have no reason to apologize, but now we're moving on to the third telling, and each of these tellings are video and or audio taped, because through each of these recordings, the person can either come up with more detail, or those details can fall by the wayside. And so that's the importance of having this information video and or audio recorded, so that you can compare the stories and how they might change over time. And this is going to increase the integrity of the data. You're going to get a sense for what are the accurate and most accurate details in this story. So we're going to do a third telling of the experiences story as a group in front of the larger expedition group debriefers in an uninterrupted fashion. So, you know, after your designated interviewers or debriefers, let the person get it off their chest. Then they ask questions in a non-leading and open-ended way. You have them, for a third time, tell the story in front of the larger expedition group, but as they did the very first time, just letting them get it off their chest uninterrupted. And then the fourth telling of the story, again, it's in front of the larger expedition group, but now there's a free-for-all questioning by anyone else in that larger group. But again, I'm sorry, my butt's hurting tonight. Again, it's still being recorded because now people are going to come in with their leading questions. They're going to come in with their own bias questions and ask people about specific things about the Bigfoot. And by recording that, that's going to allow you to compare it to the three other tellings that you have and see if there's any embellishment going on as the story gets told time and time and time and time again. Question here. Is it the same debriefer each time? Well, if you've got a group of 4 or 5 people going out and you only have one designated debriefer, and all 4 or 5 of those people have that experience, and with the designated debriefer, you've got to hear the story first, one unfettered by any questions, and then a second time asking non-leading and open-ended questions. It's going to take you a long time to do that for 4 or 5 people. And so depending on the size of the expedition group that you're going out on, you may want to train anywhere from 3 to 4 people within the group to do these debriefings. When it goes to the larger group, yes, the third telling and the fourth telling are moderated by that debriefing team. Okay, we'll see you later, John. Thanks for coming, buddy. So you want it to be of the same group of people, but in large groups, just having one designated and trained debriefer is going to extend this process too much. Any other questions? But to further answer your question, yeah, for that one person, the same debriefer does the first story, records the first interview unfettered, then the second telling with questions, and then they're present also for the third and the fourth tellings. Okay, well, good night to you, ASAP 60, ASPA 60. Thanks for attending. I appreciate it very much. I'm honored. Finally, chain of custody issues. And I think my next show, since my next show will be the last one before I record the show after that, pre-record it, I think my next show is probably going to tackle the Melba Ketchum study, because this is one of the issues, the scientific issues that I have with that study. And I think, well, I'll save that for the next show. Anyway, one of the important factors in any kind of scientific or experiential research is you've got to establish a chain of custody. What does that mean? That means who gets the data, who does the recordings and interviews, and who then is responsible for holding, storing, and securing those interviews. Who then controls people's right or ability to access those recordings. All those considerations are called chain of custody of the data, be it in scientific research or experiential research. So it should be one and only one person being made responsible for maintaining the security of these video and audio tapes. Too many cooks spoil the pot. Hate to use a cooking metaphor, but when you're cooking a meal and everybody and their mothers start coming in and adding their touches, the dish isn't going to taste like you want it to. It isn't going to maintain its flavor integrity. And that's why you want one and only one person to be responsible for maintaining the security of the video or audio tapes. That person themselves establishes policies and procedures for data examination and research. It's not just, hey, bub, I'm going to go grab John's tape from last night. I'll get it back to you whenever. Things can be audio taped over. Things can accidentally be erased. Lots of things can happen when somebody who's outside that person, who's mainly responsible, checks one out. So there should be a checkout and a check-in protocol. There should be policies and procedures about whether those tapes can be copied or not, and if they are copied, how many times and by whom. There should be policies and procedures about the maintenance, distribution, and security of the copies and policies and procedures. If only one person is going to maintain the chain of custody and somebody checks out that audio and video film and they make their own copy, I would advise against allowing that person to hold that copy. They need to return that copy back to the main person who is responsible for chain of custody. The more copies that are out there of something, the more those copies can be diluted and manipulated and changed until you're looking at something different or listening to something different from the original. If the individual who wants to check it out wants to do some research on that particular recording, there needs to be some research standards about what kind of research they're going to do and how they're going to do it. Let's see, Eric's point, though anecdotal, could possibly try and set up the same scenario and see if the same thing happens. Couldn't that be a probability of the same experience becoming quantitative? Eric, let me go back to Eric's point. I'm not getting it. Immutable data from self-report isn't that anecdotal, and hence it's not empirically driven data. Yeah, I think, Jessica, yes and no. some people say that on one hand, if you've heard one Bigfoot story, you hear them all. You've heard them all, because the themes and the general story do run in common ways. And that's one of the ways, because of those similarities and parallels, one of the things that nobody talks about as a way to elevate anecdotal data is to encode that data. You can encode the words used and the scenarios described. And if you do that to every story, encode it into a numeric data set, then you can analyze those recordings for similarities and differences. And that's a way to elevate an anecdote's scientific value. The flip side is Bigfoot encounters are kind of random. You don't know if you're going to experience one or when you're going to experience one. And as much as I just was talking about how there's are generally some similarities between stories, there are also generally some differences between stories. And so you need to set up your encoding system, reducing words and scenarios down to numeric data. You've got to allow for both the similarities and the differences. But yes, it then begins with that quantitative analysis, with assigning numbers to it and analyzing that data. You know, you're approaching scientific research. Basically, how far that gets you is you're going to see if they fit the normal curve. Can you use what are called parametric statistics? Parametric statistics are a fancy way of saying your data fits the normal curve, that bell-shaped curve, for folks not familiar with that. When you were going to grade school and the teacher gave a really hard test and everybody in the class failed it, so the teacher comes and says to you, we've got to grade it on the curve to make it fair. The curve that they're referring to is the normal curve. Interestingly enough, though, in doing that, the data itself really doesn't fit the normal curve. It's skewed because the test was so hard that nobody passed it. The dumb kids in class, as well as the brightest kids in class, didn't pass the test. So that's what we would call skewed data. And what teachers would do, at least in the high school that Eric and I went to, they would force that data onto the normal curve so that somebody would eventually, there would be a passing grade and a failing grade, failing grade and passing grades. But yes, anytime you can quantify, take your data from words or situations down to numbers, and then analyze those numbers, you're adding scientific value. You're not just eyeballing the data or making generalizations. You can make informed answers, informed responses about that data. Research policy. Yeah, modified database maintenance. Yeah. So again, the same person that's holding the original recordings also then becomes responsible for holding the copies of the data. So this was more of a casual pace. Oops. This was more of a casual pace to me. Oh, another slide. Why so many repetitions? Why so immediately? Delays and avoidance of traumatic events facilitate increased likelihood of PTSD. As when you're a therapist working with someone, the ultimate that had an experience that is horrifying and fearful for them, the ultimate goal is to help these people turn and face those fears and live through those fears with more effective coping. And that's how you treat most anxiety disorders. The natural thing for somebody to want to do when they've had that kind of experience is to avoid it. It was unpleasant. I just want to forget about it. The longer they forget about it or push it out, the more likely and the stronger their chances are of developing PTSD, and the stronger those chances become of that PTSD being resilient. It's not going to go away. It's going to keep coming back. The repeated recitations through this procedure that I've discussed in this show, that's getting those people on the right track to begin with. They're telling that story 4 times. So they're immediately being exposed and re-exposed and re-exposed and re-exposed to that event. And as that re-exposure happens, the PTSD or the trauma of that begins to lose its power or its salience. Telling the experience in front of the larger expedition allows for a few things to happen, normalizes it. Chances are in that larger group, there's going to be other people that have had similar experiences, and that gives them an opportunity to share their experiences with the people who just had it. And that kind of lets the people that just had it know that they're not alone. This can be a normal thing when you're out there looking for Bigfoot. It also gives people a chance to offer and receive support and empathy. It also uses the group process, the interactions of the people in the group, to identify possible misinformation or embellished information for that much. And then it also increases the entire group expedition's investment in the investigative process. You're in effect using the Hawthorne effect in a positive way. For those people who didn't attend my shows on bias, the Hawthorne effect, a company was losing money and their productivity was down, and they hired a consultant firm to come in and try and figure out why their productivity and production were going down. Well, lo and behold, for the week or two that they studied that company, the production went up. There were no deficits. And that's called the Hawthorne effect, meaning just the process of observing a group and their knowledge of that observation is likely to impact the group that's being studied. And it's typically, when you're dealing with production, it's increased production. And so by the entire group becoming more invested in this scientific investigative process, it's going to benefit the group as a whole. If that makes sense. And questions and discussion, hopefully. Guys, I usually don't get too many questions. I've got my own hypotheses about why that is, but I'm not going to get into those. But, I really want to encourage people to ask questions. If I've said something that you don't get or isn't clear to you, please ask me to clarify it, because the whole purpose of my show is to educate and inform people about how we can use science and these techniques to improve the quality of Bigfoot research. And if I'm not getting my point across or my message across, or I'm saying it with so many highfalutin words that you're not understanding my point, I'm not accomplishing what I'm hoping to through this podcast. So please, as I said earlier in the show, there are no dumb questions. And now that we have this extended format, we've got more time. It's 20 of. We got, a good 15 minutes to ask questions if there are questions. I'm not going to beg or twist any further, beg or twist arms any further. But by all means, please, if you don't understand something or you want me to elaborate on something or clarify something, now we've got the time to do that. So, any questions? I know I'm just such an effective teacher that typically everything's crystal clear. I'm just kidding. No questions? Craig, you got any questions, buddy? Legacy just posted one. What is that? The one that you and Eric were just talking about that I put up? Is this the one? There's always one that screws up the normal curve. That's an interesting point, and that's an interesting point about one of the ways science is biased as well. When you get let's say you give a test to 100 people and you get a whole group of scores. Sometimes you're going to have unusually high scores, and sometimes you're going to have unusually low scores. And those scores are called outliers. An outlier is something so extreme in its score that it affects the shape of that normal curve. It falls outside of the normal curve. And when your data doesn't fit that bell-shaped normal curve, you can't use parametric statistics. You got to use another form of statistics. And in fact, despite all my years, and goodness gracious, I studied statistics in my master's degree, and then I had beginning statistics, intermediate statistics, and advanced statistics. And then, of course, when you do your dissertation, you're doing an experiment. And so you've got to use statistics in your dissertation. I use them in my dissertation. And one of the things we do is we just forget about. We throw out those extremely high scores or those extremely low scores. And to me, that's just a fascinating process because, in fact, what you're doing is you're throwing out data that doesn't fit the normal curve, even though that's the reality of the data that you got. So you're kind of forcing that normal curve onto it. And I think that's part of what, one of the potential faults. There are good reasons to do it, but I think it's important to understand that you're kind of stacking the deck in your favor when those extreme bits of data get thrown out. I don't know if that's what you were referring to, Jessica, or not. No, that's not it. Why don't you retype the question if you don't mind? Yes, look. Okay, let me go back. Was it to Eric's point, though anecdotal, could possibly try and set up the same scenario and see same. I think I answered that one. Is that the one? See if the same thing happens. Couldn't that begin a probability of the same experience becoming quantitative? Yeah, I addressed that, talking about how the experiences are typically random and that they share similarities as well as differences. Jennifer Arnold, you posted one. Okay, let me find it. Jennifer. Here you are. Question. Thank you, Jennifer. How would this work with digital files that may not be on tapes? Well, in today's technology, I think for the most part, we've moved away from tapes. Mostly it's digitized CDs, although you can still, I think, get cassette tapes. You can still buy the very camera that was used to film the Patterson-Gimlin film, and that was on film. I think this could be done on video and audio tapes or on digitized data. I think that the more simple you can keep it, the better. It's a lot easier to manipulate a digital file than it is to manipulate a non-digital tape of the experience. So whether it's digital or non-digital, I think what that speaks to and what can be influenced there is how easily that data can be manipulated by somebody with malintent. And that's why it's really important to have, for the person who has chain of custody of the data, to have checkout times and signatures and check back in and signatures. And it might not even hurt to include a review process before or soon after that tape is checked back in, to compare it to the original if you're getting a copy back, to try and capture people who are messing with your data. There are people out there who unfortunately will do that thing. And so the medium within which it records speaks to how that data can be manipulated and influenced outside of its original intent. I'm not sure, Jennifer, if that's answering your question or not. If it isn't, let me know. I'm still hunting for, maybe this is Jessica's. I know that's the, maybe it's this one. No, we address that one. Girl, I just, maybe you rewrote it. No, I'm not sure what other question, Jessica, you're referring to there. Jennifer, if that didn't answer your question, by all means, please let me know. Other questions or thoughts? Going once. Yes, look. Jessica, did I get the question you were referring to? Was that Jennifer's question? And Jennifer, I'm sorry, I missed it. I'm glad that I found it. That was a good question. Okay, any other questions? If not, I'm going to thank you very much for attending. This, for me, at least, this was a much less stressful show. I didn't feel pressured to rush through it, and I was able to do it in a more slower and more elaborative pace, which was rather nice for me. And I hope that made it a better show for you guys as well, having a little bit more time. As always, I'm going to ask you guys, when you're doing your Bigfoot research or whether it's just going through life, I'm going to ask you to keep your minds open, your boots on the ground, and keep your heart with your higher power. God bless you and have a good evening. We'll see you next Monday at 6 o'clock. Oh, and by the way, check out, please check out Doug Highcheck's show this Wednesday. I'm going to be one of a few people on that show, and we're going to kind of have just a round table of discussion about kind of whatever comes up, and or some of us are going to be telling some of our own personal stories. It should be an interesting show. I'm really looking forward to that, and very honored that Doug is having me on for a second time. So again, keep your minds open, your boots on the ground, and your heart with your higher power. We'll see you on Wednesday, if not Wednesday, next Monday. Be safe.
I see you running out of reason. Don't try to blame it on the season. Why you wanna walk away? When we began, swear we had something that would last. Baby, has the feeling passed? Falling in was easy. How do I make it stay? I'll never let go of you. Tried and true. Oh, I'll never let go of you. Tried and true. Was I a fool? I know sometimes I may wonder, but I would never leave asunder a thing as good as what we have. Is it a rule? What's good is worth the fighting. There ain't no denying that you and I were made to last. Falling in was easy. How can we make it stay? I'll never let go of you. Tried and true. I'll never let go of you. Tried and true. I'll never let go of you. Tried and true. I'll never let go of you. Tried and Have you had a change of heart? Can we go back to the start? I'll never let go of you. Tried and true. I'll never let go of you. Tried and true. Tried and true.
Wanna do it all with you by my side. If you're in, meet me here tonight. Be brave and come along. I'll be alright. Promise we